From my earliest memories, I knew that I was a disappointment, even though my parents never said it directly. They didn't need to. Their expressions, filled with vague hope when I was born, spoke for themselves. They had been expecting a son, hoping that, finally, their family would be complete, that I would become what they had longed for. When my sister Zita was born 3 years later, everything became clear. Their dreams, their hopes, slipped away. My parents never allowed themselves to openly express dissatisfaction, but their silence was meaningful. I, Justina, was their firstborn, a girl, and no matter how hard I tried, I could never fully win their acceptance. My mother often whispered to my father in the night, as if not wanting me to hear. Maybe the next one will be a boy. Such phrases were always tinged with regret. In some sense, when Zita came into the world, I understood. They had lost faith in their hopes for a son. My mother could no longer have children, and all their dreams of an heir remained a thing of the past. Nevertheless, Zita, as the youngest and most beloved child, had the ability to charm everyone around her. Her large brown eyes, full of trust and childish naivety, made our parents lose their heads. Her gaze was like a magical key, unlocking hearts, and they melted before her, like ice cream under the summer sun. I, on the other hand, became more and more independent, distancing myself from family concerns and perhaps excessive attachment. I learned to rely only on myself and not to expect the attention I never received. Over time, I realized that the emotional attachment and warmth every child needs were missing for me. Zita had it easy. Her smile, her simple presence, seemed to bring light and joy into the house. I, however, often stayed in the shadows, not trying to seek what wasn't there. I had everything necessary for a normal life: clothes, food, a roof over my head, education, but the feeling that I was truly needed by someone was always out of reach. Eventually, I learned to make peace with it. It became part of me. I built my inner fortress, and no words or glances could break its strength. I accepted that I would be one of those who would build their life without regard to the expectations and desires of others. I decided, would study economics. I announced this at dinner during my last year of high school. My parents exchanged glances. They waited silently for me to explain my plans. "Are you sure, dear?" my mother asked, pausing with her fork in hand. "It's such a technical field." My father nodded as well, and I understood they hadn't expected such an answer. "What about something more suitable for a young lady? Like being a teacher or a nurse?" he said, as if trying to steer me back to the right path. I didn't give in. I had already been accepted to state university, my grades were good enough for a partial scholarship, and that decision was made. "Mom, it's my choice," I said with a cold calmness that had long since become my defense mechanism. There was disappointment in my mother's voice, but it was so familiar, so predictable, that I no longer felt its weight. Zita, who was still in high school, looked at me with a smirk. "I think I'll study psychology," she said, and my parents immediately brightened. It was so typical of them. For Zita, there was always a path that led directly to their approval. "You've always been so kind," my mother fluttered again, as if reviving dreams of her daughter doing what they liked. I continued to push the peas around my plate, as though this was the only way to let their voices be background noise that I could ignore. I had long understood, fighting for their recognition meant losing. I focused on my future, on my independence. This was my path. And so I decided that for me, what others said didn't matter, but what I could achieve on my own would. At university, I met Gasper during my second year, when we accidentally bumped into each other in the library's financial department. He picked up my statistics textbook, and that's where our story began. We were both studying economics, and his eyes lit up when he learned that I was interested in macroeconomics. He was older than me, but that didn't stop us from quickly becoming close. "You're in Professor Martinez's macro class, right?" he asked, handing me back my book. I saw you asking those smart questions." I blushed. I wasn't used to being noticed in such a positive light. "Yes, that's me, the annoying person who makes the class run late," I said, laughing. But Gasper just smiled, and his words stayed with me. "Actually, I'd like to know if you'd like to grab a coffee sometime. I can tell you about the advanced courses you'll be taking next year." Our coffee meeting turned into dinner, which led to movie dates, and then to something more. We became inseparable. For the first time in my life, I felt that I was truly seen, that I was appreciated. Gasper never compared me to anyone else, and that, perhaps, was the most important thing for me. He loved me for who I was, with my quirks, with the little scars I carried on myself, as reminders of my childhood, of growing up, of learning to be strong and independent. We complemented each other so harmoniously that it sometimes felt like our story had been predestined. After graduation, Gasper started working at Anderson Consulting, and I continued my studies as if nothing had changed. He waited for me, supported me while I completed my path, and as soon as I said goodbye to the lecture halls, we decided to live together. We found a small apartment in the city center, in a building that was simple, unremarkable, but it was there, in this modest corner, that our life together began. And it was exactly as we wanted. When Gasper first came to my parents' house, I immediately felt how their attitude towards us changed. They didn't even try to hide how happy they were to see him. "Oh, Gasper!" my mother almost exclaimed, as if a gift from fate was standing before her, not a stranger. "We're so happy to finally meet you. Will you join us for Christmas?" Her voice rang out, and I saw how she tried to hide her excitement, but it was impossible. My father quickly found common ground with Gasper, patting him on the shoulder. "Son, we've heard so much about you," he exclaimed, and I felt how the word "son" echoed in their voices like some kind of victory. Finally, they had what they had always dreamed of. Even if this son wasn't their own, but brought into the family through marriage. I watched as my parents practically fawned over Gasper, asking him about his plans for the future, when he planned to settle down. "So when are you planning to have children?" my mother would casually ask, her desperation barely hidden. All of this was so predictable that I didn't feel anger or resentment. I, on the other hand, couldn't help but notice how Zita, sitting in the corner, cast spiteful glances at us. She clearly couldn't stand that now I was the one who had what she had desperately wanted. Namely, a real family, relationships, attention. She sat silently, her gaze full of envy, which she tried to conceal behind a cold mask. A year into our life together, when Gasper and I were quietly enjoying the comfort of our small apartment, he suddenly dropped to one knee during a quiet dinner and proposed. I immediately said yes, without hesitation. For us, it was a natural step. We decided to have a small, intimate wedding, despite all the pleas from our parents, who, of course, wanted something bigger, more grandiose. "This is your big day, Justina, don't you want something more special?" my mother tried to persuade me. But I was firm in my decision. "This is special. Gasper and I have decided this," I said, and despite her disappointment, she eventually agreed. The wedding was just as we had dreamed, in a small garden, surrounded by the closest people. We exchanged vows, and the evening passed in an atmosphere of warmth and peace. When we returned to our apartment as husband and wife, I felt that this was the beginning of our new life, that everything that had come before was just preparation for being here, now, together. The question of a child came up almost immediately after our honeymoon. My mother never missed an opportunity to bring it up. "When can we expect some good news, Justina?" Her eyes sparkled, and I saw how eager she was for a grandchild. Gasper and I had always said that we needed to be financially stable before starting a family. We were both determined to build our life from the ground up, based on principles of independence and confidence in the future. But, as often happens, the topic of children became number one at family dinners, the children of friends, acquaintances, neighbors. Some of them were already grandparents, some had not yet grown up, while Gasper and I had no good news to share. This parental anxiety and constant hints became unbearable. And so, after 2 years, we finally bought our first home. It was modest, but so familiar and beloved, and when we signed the mortgage papers, we felt that we had reached the next milestone in our life. However, it didn't take long for me to realize that my expectations were not entirely correct. 3 months after we moved into our new house, Zita announced at one of the family dinners, "I'm pregnant." She said these words calmly, placing her hand on her still flat stomach. John Marco, her boyfriend, whom none of us liked, had been her partner for 6 months. Neither my parents nor I approved of him, but Zita was unstoppable in her decision. The next few months became a real trial for me, a hurricane that tore apart my established views on life. John Marco disappeared as soon as Zita started showing, leaving her alone, running back to his parents. I couldn't believe how quickly he vanished without leaving a trace. Zita, on the other hand, acted as if everything had gone according to plan, and although her world was falling apart, she somehow kept herself together. But what followed her loneliness shocked me. Instead of hiding from judgment, my parents turned their home into a sanctuary for their future granddaughter. When little Emily was born, you would have thought she was a royal princess. My parents transformed Zita's old room into a nursery, bought every conceivable baby item, and took care of every detail. Everything in the house revolved around Emily. They lived for her. My mother seemed ready to become the perfect grandmother, rocking Emily during our visits. Every time I came home, her eyes sparkled at the sight of the little girl, and her hands were full of care. "Isn't she the perfect mother?" my mother would ask, gazing lovingly at me. And then she would look at Gasper, who, without a second thought, would lie down on the floor to play with the little one, making funny faces, entertaining her with stuffed toys and children's books. He got along so naturally with children. My mother would smile and say, "Look how great he gets along with her, Justina. He's going to be an amazing father." And each time, her words, like an invisible hand, tore at my heart. I felt those words echo in my soul. Why couldn't Gasper and I become parents? I began to track my cycle, take vitamins, do everything recommended on pregnancy websites. Gasper and I tried month after month, but nothing happened. While Gasper spent more and more time at my parents' house, playing with Emily, I felt the pressure building around me. "She's so cute, did you see her starting to walk?" Gasper would say when we drove home, his eyes shining with joy. "Did you see how she almost said uncle?" He continued with a smile. And every time, his words cut through me. Why am I not pregnant? Why is nothing happening for us? And how do I survive this? I tried to push these thoughts away, convincing myself that everything would come in time. It just takes patience. But with each passing month, with each day spent in this tension, I felt the anxiety growing inside me. What if something is wrong with us? What if I can't become a mother? This worry slowly began to destroy my soul. And then, when Gasper and I marked a year of unsuccessful attempts, my mother, unable to bear it any longer, finally intervened. "Justina, something's wrong." Her words left me no chance to hide. "You need to see a doctor immediately." She practically started sending me fertility specialist contacts. The very next day, before we left her house, she handed me a folder full of business cards, as if our happiness depended on it. And even though I could feel the pressure of her attention, I still agreed, not wanting to be the constant object of her worry any longer. We made an appointment, and Gasper came with me. He held my hand tightly, and I could feel how his support gave me strength in that sterile, cold office. The doctor asked questions, but I could hardly hear her words. Everything around me seemed to fade, and it was just me and Gasper, who was quietly whispering words of comfort. But when the day for the results came, I was prepared for any news, except for this one. I'm sorry, the doctor said regretfully. The tests show that you're infertile. These words hit me in the chest like a lightning strike, stunning me and leaving an empty void in my mind. I felt cold sweat rolling down my cheeks, but I couldn't move. Gasper squeezed my hand tightly, and I barely felt it. The doctor continued talking about options, treatments, but her words seemed to vanish into the air. They didn't matter to me. That evening, Gasper and I sat at the kitchen table, barely touching our takeout dinner. We spoke, but it was mechanical, as if everything happening around us had no significance. We could consider adoption or IVF, Gasper said, and his voice almost sounded comforting, as if it were a solution, not a loss. Finally, there are options. I nodded, but inside, I only felt emptiness. I couldn't think of anything else. How was I supposed to tell my family? How could I tell them that Gasper and I had no future, the future they had been waiting for? The answer came at the next family dinner, just as I had feared. I decided that I couldn't hide this painful truth any longer. It only took one moment when the conversation quieted slightly, and I spoke, my throat tightening. I need to tell you something I found out. I took a deep breath, trying to gather the strength to say the words that now burned my soul. I can't have children. I'm infertile. These words reverberated through the room, like a thunderclap, pulling me out of reality. First, there was complete silence, as if everyone had frozen, and the world collapsed in an instant. A wave of shame and fear hit my face, and I felt the darkness tighten in my chest. My mother was the first to break the silence. But her reaction was far more brutal than I could have imagined. Infertile? She spat out the word like venom, like something indelible, something that should make me despised. What kind of woman can't do at least the one thing she was made for? She said it with such an expression on her face that I felt nauseous. My father didn't even look at me, as though I didn't exist. He mumbled something incoherent, like an empty vessel, as though I meant nothing to him. And Zita sat there, smirking, happily bouncing on her lap with her daughter, Emily, continuing to make that smug face that I had always found arrogant. Well, I guess we know who the real woman in the family is, she said with a particular tone, as if stating an indisputable fact. I looked at Gasper, desperately searching for even a hint of support in his eyes, but he just sat there, staring at his plate, as though he was disappearing in that moment, dissolving into nothingness. His silence was more painful than all the words combined. And then, just as if on cue, hot tears began to roll down my cheeks, uncontrollable, torrential. I pushed myself away from the table, unable to endure this nightmare any longer, and ran out of the house, ignoring the calls behind me. Every word spoken in that room had cut me deeply. I could no longer stay with them. I couldn't bear to look into their eyes anymore. After that night, I didn't return home, but Gasper continued to spend time with my family, chatting with Zita, playing with Emily. Every word he said felt like a knife piercing my heart. Emily learned a new song, he said. You should have seen how she danced in the living room. Or, Zita made an amazing lasagna, she really cooks well. These little details, these words, seemed to deliberately emphasize everything I couldn't give him. Everything I couldn't offer him. I lay awake, tossing in bed, listening to his even breathing beside me. Sometimes I felt like he despised me, like he was angry at me for not being able to give him children. This guilt tormented me, tore me apart inside, and I didn't know how to cope with it. It was an ordinary Tuesday when my life turned upside down again. I came home early from work, with Chinese takeout that Gasper loved, hoping for at least a small moment of closeness. But the house was empty and dark. His car wasn't in the driveway, which always seemed strange. I felt something tighten inside me. I called his cell, but there was no answer. I called again and again, silence. Then, suddenly, my phone vibrated, and I saw a notification from Instagram. Zita had posted a new photo. I usually ignored her posts, but something made me click on it. My stomach twisted in horror when I saw the photo. Gasper was sitting on my parents' couch, Emily on his lap, and Zita was leaning into him, smiling at the camera. The three of them looked so happy, like one big family. The caption read, "Family time with my favorite people." My hands trembled as I grabbed the car keys, trying to convince myself that it was just an innocent picture. But I knew it wasn't. I knew that this image revealed something far more destructive than I could have imagined. On the drive to my parents' house, I replayed every interaction between Gasper and Zita over the past year in my mind, seeing them in a new, terrible light. When I arrived at the house, everything was as usual: the driveway with my parents' cars, Gasper's sedan. The front door was open, as always, and I quietly slipped inside. My heart was pounding so hard that I felt it might burst out of my chest. I could hear voices from the living room. "Gasper, we already think of you as a son," my mother said. "You deserve to be happy. You've been so wonderful with Emily," my father added. Zita continued her game. "Well, she's young, fertile, you could have more kids, think about it." My mother went on, "Why stay trapped in a marriage with her?" Her voice dropped, but I still heard that disgust, like a knife in my heart. Unable to hold back, I stormed into the room, causing everyone to jump in surprise. The scene felt like a nightmare. My parents and sister were sitting on the couch, Gasper in the armchair, while Emily played with blocks on the floor. Everything looked exactly as I had always dreamed, but something was wrong. What the hell is going on? My voice was louder than I felt. At least Gasper had the decency not to turn away immediately, but my parents remained defiant, uncomprehending, helpless. Justina's mother stood up. Her chin was lifted, and in her eyes was a flash of determination, as if she was ready to defend her truth, no matter how bitter it might be. "We're just discussing what's best for everyone," she said, as though trying to convince me that her words were not a cool game, but the only right path. I looked at her as though she were a stranger. With a trembling voice, barely holding back my emotions, I said, "Best for everyone? Are you trying to convince my husband to leave me for my sister?" My hand gripped the armrest of the chair, and I felt my fingers stiffen like stone. Zita sat across from me, wearing a smirk on her face. That smirk was full of confidence, as if she believed everything had already been decided, and I was nothing more than a witness to their happiness. She reached out to place her hand on Gasper's, as though it was all over, and I was just an observer of their triumph. I turned sharply toward Gasper, hoping that at least in this moment he would defend me, say that all of this madness didn't make sense. But no, he sat there, his gaze fixed on the floor. His silence was worse than any blow. "Gasper." My voice sounded like a scream, almost tearing itself out. I could feel the weight in my chest, how the air was poisoned by the pain. He looked up, and in his eyes, I read only regret, but no love. "I'm sorry, Justina," his words sounded hollow, like echoes of foreign feelings. "They're right. I want children. I want a family, and I've developed feelings for Zita." His confession froze me. It was like a blow that knocked all the strength out of my chest. Zita smirked, her lips stretching into a self-satisfied grin. I could barely hold myself back from screaming in rage. "Get out," I could barely say it, but the bitterness and disgust inside me were stronger. My gaze flicked over the faces of those present. My father sat with a stone expression, his face chiseled like stone, and his eyes empty and cold. My mother stood like a statue, her eyes full of careless triumph, as if she had been fine with this decision all along. And there she sat, smug and satisfied, while Gasper, absent, meaningless, his eyes no longer held any regret or love. It was just an act. My body seemed to know what to do as I turned and rushed out. My legs could barely hold me up, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't stay there, in the midst of this lie. Days later, I returned home, not knowing what to do. My brain was on autopilot. The suitcase was packed in no time, without a second thought. I wrote Gasper a note and left it on the kitchen counter. "I've asked my lawyer to contact yours." In her simple words lay all the bitterness of our parting. The divorce was quick, clinical, cold, like a process that left no room for feelings. We divided everything evenly, as was proper. My life became empty, and I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, shutting myself off from everyone. But the world wouldn't let me forget. Social media was always full of news, and one day, my colleague, with surprise in her voice, commented, "Oh my God, Justina, I just saw this." She was holding her phone, and on the screen, I saw my sister's face, Zita, in a white dress, standing next to Gasper, who looked so happy. My parents were beaming beside them, as if this were a scene from a movie where I wasn't part of the family. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the pain, but it was impossible to ignore. "It's all good," I said quietly, though everyone knew it was far from true. They were probably happy, it was obvious. A year later, another message appeared on the horizon: "Welcome, baby Rose." I exhaled. They had their daughter. Gasper now had his perfect family, Emily, whom he had adopted, and a child from Zita, the one he had always dreamed of. My soul was empty, but I could no longer watch their happiness. I deleted all my social media accounts that same day, feeling like life was finally starting to take shape. Life, however, has a surprising way of delivering its twists. One Saturday, while I was shopping for groceries, I accidentally bumped into someone in the aisle. "Sorry," said a deep voice, and I looked up. They were the kindest brown eyes I had ever seen. He helped me gather the groceries I had dropped and offered to buy me a coffee to apologize for his clumsiness. "My name's Michael," he said with a soft smile. One coffee turned into dinner, dinner into a date, and soon I was in love again, but this time, I was honest from the start. 6 months later, on a warm evening, sitting in the kitchen, I told him that I couldn't have children. "I'm infertile." It was hard, but I said it. Michael took my hands in his and said, "Justina, I love you. If we ever want children, we'll adopt. But for now, I just want to be with you." It was so simple and so peaceful. We got married quietly, with no fanfare, at the courthouse, with a few close friends, and no one had any expectations, just love. But a year after our wedding, I started to feel a strange unease. Morning sickness, dizziness. Michael insisted that I see a doctor. "Mrs. Neri," the doctor, said as she looked at the results of my tests, "Congratulations, you're pregnant." I stared at her as if she were a ghost, unable to believe what I had just heard. It was impossible. I was infertile. I had all the tests to prove it. My chest tightened with anxiety, and my throat seemed to be squeezed by an invisible hand. My thoughts became jumbled. How could this have happened? The doctor smiled, and despite my doubts, she continued, trying to reassure me, "The human body can be mysterious. Despite everything, pregnancy can occur even in cases of diagnosed infertility. It's rare, but it happens." She was clearly nervous, but her words slowly began to break through my wall of disbelief. I couldn't think or speak. It felt like the entire world had compressed into a single point. How the hell was this possible? That night, sitting in the chair by the window, Michael and I cried with joy and confusion. We couldn't believe this happiness, as if it weren't meant for us. We had dreamed of this for so many years, and I had prayed, begged the universe for a chance. And now, after months of struggle and despair, I was holding a miracle. I didn't tell my family. They had lost the right to share in my happiness. They had forfeited that chance after they destroyed my life and then went down the same path, taking my happiness from me without a second thought. I wanted to keep this to myself, from Michael and me, and for our future. Because that's what mattered, our happiness. 9 months later, on that winter day, when I finally held my son in my arms, heavy and so beautiful, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Leon, my protector, my boy. He was perfect, everything I had ever dreamed of. His little face was flawless, and when I looked at him, all the bitterness, pain, regret, and resentment melted away. In his eyes, I saw an entire world, and that world was filled with nothing but love. He became my new life. Michael was the perfect father, just as I had become the perfect mother to our son. We savored every moment. Life fell into a beautiful rhythm. We rarely left the house, preferring to spend evenings surrounded by our little family. We sat at the table, drank tea, and laughed, unaware of any troubles. But, as in all good stories, the moment came that changed everything. It happened that evening when Michael received a promotion. We decided to celebrate at a restaurant, a lavish French place in the city center. We were happy, unaware that it was there that I would face something I didn't want to see. There she was. Zita. My sister. Locked in the arms of a man who definitely wasn't Gasper. They were sitting in a corner, but not hidden enough for me not to see them. Their bodies were entwined, their lips locked in a passionate kiss. She gently ran her fingers through his hair, ignoring everything around her, as if the world had ceased to exist. I froze, unable to believe my eyes. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and took several pictures. The lighting in the restaurant was dim, but the photos were clear enough to leave no doubt. In one of them, Zita and her lover looked as though no one else existed around them. "Justina, are you okay?" Michael gently touched my hand. I looked at him, feeling the pain grow inside. He knew the whole story, how Zita and Gasper had destroyed my world, taken everything I loved. He knew this woman was now trying to destroy it all over again. I was silent, unable to speak, and just showed him the photos. He looked at them and sighed quietly. His jaw tightened. He knew how much all of this hurt me. But what was I supposed to do? I could have sought revenge, sent those photos to them all, shattering their perfect little family, but no. I wasn't like that. I kept the photos in a secure folder, leaving them just for myself. It was my truth, but I wasn't going to ruin anyone else's life like they had ruined mine. A year passed, and Leon became a little miracle. Michael and I went to my old neighborhood to meet a friend. We were walking in the park, enjoying the good weather, when suddenly, rounding a corner near the supermarket, we ran into them. Our eyes met the moment I saw them. My parents, Zita, and Gasper, were loading groceries into their car. At first, they didn't recognize us, averting their gaze as if they wanted to disappear. But then their eyes fell on Leon, who was holding my hand and talking about his new toy truck. My mother froze in place, rooted to the spot. "Who is that?" she asked, not hiding her surprise. I knew this was inevitable. I could have just walked past, could have left, but something held me back. This was my son. My Leon. "This is my son," I said calmly, confidently, without the slightest hesitation. I wasn't afraid of them. Zita laughed, as always, mockingly. "Oh please, we all know you can't have children. Which agency did you adopt him from?" Her voice was filled with contempt. I looked her straight in the eyes, savoring the moment when I gave birth to him 3 years ago. "No adoption agency was involved," I said clearly and firmly, as if each word were proof of my determination. My mother stood there, stunned, not knowing how to react, her face a mixture of surprise and indignation. She, as always, tried to control everything that had to do with my life, but now I no longer allowed her to dictate what was right and what wasn't. "This is impossible, Mom," she mumbled, clearly unwilling to accept the truth, just as she hadn't all these years. She, like Zita, kept trying to convince herself that I didn't deserve happiness. But the doctor had said that doctors make mistakes, and sometimes, it happens. It's rare, but it happens. And here's the proof. I pointed to Leon, who was curiously watching the strangers around him. His eyes, filled with childlike curiosity, didn't understand the significance of the moment, but I knew that he was my victory. He was part of me, part of Michael, part of everything I had ever dreamed of. At that moment, it seemed to me that the world, which had been in fragile balance all these years, was now on the verge of collapsing. Mom and Dad, who had once rejected me, were standing before me like beggars. My father, gritting his teeth, had finally realized that we had a grandson. He stepped forward, his eyes filled with a strange, painfully familiar expression. He started moving toward me, but before he could get any closer, my mother extended her arms, expecting me to let her embrace my son. I stood in front of Leon, shielding him with my body, like a wild animal protecting its offspring. "No," I said, calmly and firmly, as I never had before. "You have no right to do this. You have no right to be part of his life. You lost that privilege when you betrayed me. When you threw me away like trash." My fist clenched. My words hung in the air, and everyone around us froze. My mother recoiled, her face turning a disgusting shade of red. Zita stood next to her, trying to conceal her anger. She had always been the favorite, always given the best of everything, but now, it seemed, everything had changed. And she couldn't accept it. "Oh, get a grip, Justina," Zita sneered, her voice trembling with fury. "You've turned this into some huge issue, with your child. I still won, you know. I took your husband, gave him a real family, 2 beautiful daughters. Admit it. I'm still better than you'll ever be." I felt the anger rise in me like a wave, but instead of backing down, I silently pulled out my phone. Her words no longer had any power. I showed her the photo I had taken in the restaurant. "Why don't you tell everyone about your extracurricular activities?" I paused, savoring her confusion as she tried to understand what I was talking about. "What are you talking about?" Gasper seemed not to understand what was happening, but despite that, I handed him my phone, showing pictures of his wife lost in the arms of another man. "Here's your loving wife, dining with someone else," I said, coldly watching her reaction. "Although, I must say, Zita, you probably fall in love with everyone who sits next to you, don't you?" Zita's face turned pale as Gasper snatched the phone from my hands and immediately looked at the photos. I could see his face changing as he began to realize what he had lost. Mom and Dad stood nearby, huddled together, their eyes wide with shock. "Who is he?" Gasper asked, his voice shaking with rage. He seemed unable to believe his eyes. Zita was stunned, her words tangled as she tried to justify herself. He's just a work friend," she muttered. But I calmly added, "Friends don't kiss, Zita. Friends don't meet in the dark corners of expensive restaurants while their spouses are at home with the kids." I saw her face flush red with shame, but she couldn't respond. She tried to justify herself, but nothing worked. My mother gasped, her face turning the same shade of red as Zita's when she realized her daughter was not perfect, that her conquests left many questions. "After everything you've done, Zita, after you helped her steal my husband, you dare to talk about this?" I couldn't hold back my laughter when this realization hit. I looked at her, and in her eyes, I saw fear. Fear of losing everything. I smiled, knowing this was just the beginning for her. She had always been the one to find a way out of any situation, but now, she wouldn't be able to escape. Gasper and Zita started shouting at each other right there in the parking lot, as if all the invisible walls of these years had collapsed in an instant. I calmly looked at Michael, took Leon's hand, and said, "It's time to go home." And we walked away, leaving them in their chaos. Leon, happily chattering about the park we were heading to, paid no attention to the nuclear explosion we had just walked away from. We were moving toward our future, leaving them with their ruins. A month later, I learned the whole truth. Gasper had suspected something was wrong and took the tests himself. He found out that he was infertile. And that meant little Rose, whom he thought was his daughter, couldn't have been his. He immediately abandoned her, refusing to pay child support. He didn't even want to see his daughter. Zita went back to our parents, her perfect life shattered. All her attempts to contact me, calls, emails, visits, were in vain. I didn't want to return to that world. "Please, Justina, we made a terrible mistake," my mother begged through the door. "Let us be part of Leon's life. He's our only grandson." But I quietly replied, "Actions have consequences." Michael supported me in this decision. He always said that family isn't just about DNA. It's about love, respect, and loyalty. And they hadn't shown me any of these qualities. Now, looking at my little family, I knew that I had everything I needed. Michael, my wonderful husband, who loved me regardless of whether I could have children. And my miracle son, who proved that the doctors were wrong. Our home was filled with laughter, joy, and warmth. Sometimes, the family you were born into is not the one you are meant to be with. Sometimes, you build your own family with people who choose you. I chose Michael. He chose me. We chose Leon, and he chose us back, with his first smile, his first word, his first steps. That's what a real family means. And I wouldn't want it any other way.